The Senate hearing room hummed with restrained anticipation as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett took her place at the witness table. Her crimson blazer stood out sharply against the wood-paneled walls, the kind of visual that cameras love and critics can't ignore. Every C-SPAN lens in the chamber turned her way. At the elevated dais sat Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, his expression carved into the familiar lines of authority. He leaned toward his microphone, voice low but pointed. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his tone edged with condescension, "you Democrats always come to these hearings armed with talking points about health care, but you have no understanding of the economic consequences of your policies. You've never run a business. You don't know what it's like to meet a payroll." The room fell silent. Even the staffers paused mid-motion, sensing a moment of tension. Johnson wasn't asking a question. He was delivering a rebuke. "Instead of lecturing us about Wisconsin's healthcare system," he added, "maybe you should take a moment to understand how the real world works outside your liberal bubble." The camera zoomed in on Crockett's face, calm, unreadable, her eyes flashing just once before settling into composure. Most witnesses wilt under such an attack from a senior senator. Crockett simply opened a folder that had been resting beside her, its contents neatly tabbed and highlighted. She met Johnson's gaze. "Senator, since you've raised the issue of understanding the real world, let's start there." The murmurs in the room quieted. Reporters straightened in their seats. No one expected the freshman congresswoman from Texas to go toe-to-toe with one of the Senate's longest-serving Republicans. But the next few minutes would rewrite expectations entirely. Ron Johnson had built his career as a business-minded fiscal conservative, touting free market ideals and railing against what he called government overreach. To his supporters, he was a steadfast guardian of economic sanity. To his critics, he was out of touch with working families' struggles. The hearing that day was supposed to be routine, another in a long series of sessions examining state health care challenges and solutions. But Crockett, known in Congress for her fearless questioning and sharp command of data, had requested to testify after learning that no voice from underrepresented or underserved communities had been included. It wasn't just another policy discussion. With midterm elections looming and healthcare still ranking among voters' top concerns, both parties were searching for narratives to carry home. Wisconsin, a state where rural hospitals had shuttered and insurance premiums had soared, had become a political battleground for the healthcare debate. When the chair recognized her, Crockett began evenly. "Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you. I come before you not just as a representative from Texas, but as someone who has studied healthcare access across all 50 states. Since Senator Johnson has spoken about the economic impact of healthcare policies, I'd like to address what those impacts look like in his home state of Wisconsin." Johnson shifted in his chair. The faintest flicker of unease crossed his face. Crockett continued, "This isn't about partisan lines. It's about people. People who deserve to know how policy decisions affect their lives." She opened the folder before her, its pages crisp and color-coded. According to the most recent Commonwealth Fund state healthcare rankings, Wisconsin has fallen from 7th to 24th since you took office, Senator Johnson. "Are you aware of that decline?" Johnson cleared his throat. "Those rankings are politically biased. They reward states that throw taxpayer money at government programs." Crockett's reply was immediate and precise. "They measure preventable hospital admissions, infant mortality, and cost accessibility. Hardly partisan metrics. But if you prefer, we can use figures from the American Medical Association. They show the same downward trend." The chairman attempted to keep order. "Please allow the senator to respond fully, Congresswoman." Crockett nodded politely. "Of course, Mr. Chairman." Johnson glanced at his notes, visibly irritated. "As I was saying, those rankings don't reflect the real quality of care. They're flawed in methodology." "Respectfully, Senator," Crockett replied, "when you question my understanding of healthcare realities, you invite facts into the discussion. Let's talk about Wisconsin's realities." She lifted a chart showing a map of the state. 12 counties were marked in red. These are Wisconsin counties that have lost rural hospitals during your tenure. Each one represents thousands of people now forced to drive more than an hour for emergency care. Would you like to explain to them why? The chairman's gavel came down. Congresswoman, this committee is not for interrogating members. With respect, Mr. Chairman, she answered evenly. The senator questioned my grasp of real-world impacts. I'm simply clarifying what those impacts look like in his own state. Johnson's jaw tightened. Those closures were the result of federal reimbursement failures. Democratic policies, I might add. Crockett flipped another tab in her folder. Interesting you say that. According to the American Hospital Association, these closures were primarily due to Wisconsin's refusal to expand Medicaid, a decision you personally supported. She held up the report. Page 47, Senator. Your state's policy decisions are listed as a case study in how rejecting Medicaid expansion led directly to rural hospital insolvency. You're cherry-picking data, Johnson said sharply. Then let's broaden it, Crockett countered. Since 2016, Wisconsin's preventable hospital readmissions have increased by 14%. Minnesota, right next door, saw a 9% decrease during the same period. The only major difference? Minnesota expanded Medicaid. The silence in the chamber was thick. Staffers exchanged nervous glances. The committee had veered far from its original agenda, but no one dared interrupt. Crockett pressed forward. Prescription drug costs for Wisconsin seniors are now the 8th highest in the nation. You've voted 3 times against allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices. Is that what you call fiscal responsibility? The free market, Johnson said, his tone rising, is the best mechanism to control costs. Government interference kills innovation. Then explain this. Crockett held up another chart comparing drug prices between Wisconsin and Canada. The same drugs made by the same companies cost Wisconsin seniors 3 times more. Is that innovation or exploitation? The chairman intervened again. Congresswoman, please refrain from debating. I'm simply providing data, Mr. Chairman. She turned back to Johnson. As a civil rights attorney, I've represented families denied access to health care, some of them from your own state. Like the Andersons from Eau Claire, who lost their dairy farm after medical bills from cancer treatment drove them into bankruptcy. Their story was published in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Would you like me to submit those documents into the record? Johnson's lips pressed together. His staff whispered frantically behind him. Individual cases don't define policy, he managed finally. Wisconsin still has some of the best hospitals in the country. Absolutely, Crockett said, her tone disarmingly agreeable. The University of Wisconsin Hospital is exceptional, but excellence means little if access disappears. She tapped her tablet, projecting another map onto the screen. 27% of Wisconsin residents now live in areas classified as healthcare deserts, up from 11% a decade ago. The darkest areas on this map represent your most loyal voting counties. The revelation hit hard. Several senators murmured quietly among themselves. A Democratic member leaned into his mic. Congresswoman Crockett, could you compare Wisconsin's standing to Texas, since you're from there? Gladly, she replied. Texas ranks dead last, 51st, including D.C., in healthcare access. We pursued the same policies Senator Johnson supports. I'm not defending Texas. I'm warning Wisconsin. Johnson shot back. Healthcare is complex. These metrics can't capture the regulatory costs driving prices up. Crockett nodded. That's true, which is why I brought Wisconsin's own Department of Health Services report. Your office helped compile it last year. She lifted a state-sealed document. It lists the primary causes of rising healthcare costs. Regulatory burden ranks 7th. Above it are pharmaceutical pricing, insurance overhead, and hospital consolidation, all issues you voted against addressing. The chairman called a brief recess. Cameras clicked non-stop as staffers scrambled. Johnson's aides rushed to his side with new notes, but the damage was already broadcast to millions. When the hearing resumed, Johnson's demeanor had shifted from confident to cautious. He cleared his throat and tried to pivot. While I appreciate your passion, Congresswoman, your statistics overlook improvements in specialized care. Wisconsin has expanded treatment access for chronic conditions. Crockett gave a measured nod. That's an interesting claim. Let's review that. She produced an internal memo on Wisconsin Department of Health letterhead. This report, dated 3 months ago, contradicts your statement. It says specialized care remains concentrated in 3 urban counties, leaving nearly 60% of Wisconsin residents with below-average access to cardiologists, oncologists, and pediatric specialists. A collective gasp swept the room. Johnson leaned forward, his tone defensive. "Where did you obtain that memo?" "It was shared with the Congressional Healthcare Access Caucus," Crockett replied evenly. "It's not classified, just not widely circulated." The tension was electric. Reporters typed furiously, cameras zooming in. Crockett continued before anyone could interrupt. "But let's put documents aside. I'd like to introduce someone who represents the human side of this data." She gestured toward the gallery. An older woman rose slowly. "This is Barbara Lawson from Hayward, Wisconsin. Her husband died after their local hospital closed. He couldn't reach another facility in time during a cardiac event. That hospital would have remained open had Wisconsin accepted Medicaid expansion funds, a policy you opposed. Senator..." The room went silent again. "These are not partisan hypotheticals," Crockett said softly. "They're human consequences." Johnson attempted to respond, but Crockett wasn't finished. "I have 37 additional statements from Wisconsin families in similar situations, all from counties you won, Senator." "These are your constituents," the chairman interjected again, urging focus on policy solutions. "I agree, Mr. Chairman," Crockett said, lifting another chart. "Here are Wisconsin's projected healthcare outcomes under 3 targeted reforms: Medicaid expansion, Medicare drug negotiation, and restoration of rural healthcare subsidies. Based on analysis from the University of Wisconsin, these measures would elevate the state's healthcare ranking from 24th to 10th within 4 years, while saving taxpayers $1.4 billion. Johnson tried to regain footing. "Those projections assume flawless implementation." "Actually, Senator," Crockett replied, her tone crisp, "they assume inefficiency. They're modeled on worst-case outcomes and still produce improvements." The confrontation had become something more than partisan sparring. It was data versus deflection, facts versus familiarity. And Crockett wasn't done yet. When the chairman gavelled the session back into order, the air still felt heavy with the weight of Crockett's data. Senator Johnson leaned forward, posture rigid, attempting to recover ground. "Congresswoman," he began, his voice measured but tight, "you're cherry-picking negative outcomes to create a partisan narrative. Healthcare isn't just about government programs. It's about freedom. People should be free to choose their own plans, their own doctors, without Washington dictating their care." Crockett folded her hands neatly on the desk. "Freedom without access isn't freedom, Senator. It's an illusion. And when policy decisions make care unaffordable or unavailable, those choices vanish." She paused, letting the silence carry. Then she added quietly, "The people who lost hospitals in rural Wisconsin didn't choose that. The parents who can't afford insulin for their children didn't choose that. But they're living with those consequences." The hearing room felt smaller now, closer, charged. Johnson forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're very good at making speeches, Congresswoman. But in the real world, someone has to pay for all these programs. You can't keep throwing taxpayer dollars at every problem." Crockett opened another folder. "Then let's talk about who's paying right now." She drew out a single sheet. This document is from Wisconsin's Legislative Fiscal Bureau. It estimates that the state's refusal to expand Medicaid has cost taxpayers $1.6 billion over the past decade. Money that could have been saved if federal funding had been accepted. "That's not Democratic math, Senator. That's your own state agency's report." Johnson frowned. "Those funds come with federal strings attached. You can't rely on Washington promises." "Federal funding," Crockett said, "is funded by the very taxpayers you say you're protecting. The people of Wisconsin already paid for those dollars. They're just not getting them back." There was an audible reaction from the audience. Even some Republican aides glanced uncomfortably at one another. "Furthermore," Crockett continued, "Wisconsin's small businesses pay higher premiums than 43 other states. The median family premium has risen by over $7,000 in the last decade. Do you know how many dairy farmers that forced out of operation? Johnson shook his head. You can't blame me for national trends, she smiled faintly. I'm not blaming you, Senator. I'm holding you accountable for votes you proudly took. She flipped through her notes. You voted against capping insulin prices, against expanding rural broadband, which would allow telemedicine access, against the Rural Hospital Stabilization Fund, and against the Lower Drug Costs Now Act. All 4 measures directly affect Wisconsin residents. Johnson's jaw flexed, the camera catching every twitch. Those bills were loaded with unrelated spending. Every spending bill contains provisions, but the votes are public and the consequences measurable. The people back home aren't reading fine print, they're reading medical bills. The chairman tried once more to steer the discussion. Congresswoman, please keep your remarks relevant to the topic of health care reform. They are, Mr. Chairman, Crockett replied calmly. Reform requires accountability. She turned toward Johnson again. Let's step away from numbers for a moment. I want to ask you something simple. Do you believe health care is a right or a privilege? Johnson hesitated. It's a service, one that's earned and paid for. Crockett nodded, her expression thoughtful. Then I suppose the newborn in rural Wisconsin who doesn't survive because the nearest hospital closed didn't earn it yet. The room went still. I've heard you call yourself pro-life. Senator, she added quietly, but life doesn't end at birth. It continues through childhood checkups, cancer screenings, prenatal care, and senior prescriptions. You can't claim to defend life while voting against the systems that sustain it. The words landed hard. The chair tapped his gavel lightly, not to interrupt, but to give the room a moment to breathe. Crockett turned a page in her notes. I didn't come here to grandstand. I came because I've seen what happens when policy turns people invisible. You asked about real-world experience. I've sat with mothers who had to choose between paying rent and buying insulin for their children. I've watched veterans denied coverage for PTSD treatment. I've been in courtrooms fighting for families who lost everything over medical debt. That's my real world, Senator. A ripple of murmurs moved through the audience, some nodding, others watching in quiet disbelief. Johnson leaned toward the microphone again. With all due respect, Congresswoman, you don't understand Wisconsin. You're not from there. Crockett smiled politely. Maybe not, Senator, but I understand Americans, and last I checked, they live in every state. The crowd broke into a restrained wave of applause before the chairman reminded them to remain orderly. Johnson's irritation was visible now. So what's your solution? Another trillion-dollar bureaucracy? Another layer of red tape strangling innovation? Crockett stood. The gesture was slow, deliberate. She adjusted her blazer and looked directly at the senator. My solution, Senator, is to stop confusing compassion with bureaucracy. To stop treating healthcare like a privilege for the lucky few. My solution is to expand Medicaid, allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices, and hold pharmaceutical companies accountable for profit margins that triple every other sector. Johnson interjected sharply. You can't regulate success out of existence. Crockett didn't flinch. Success? I call it extortion. When a vial of insulin that costs $5 to make sells for $300. That's not innovation. That's exploitation wrapped in free market rhetoric. The room erupted again, cameras flashing. The chairman's gavel struck the desk twice. Order, please, he said firmly. Crockett remained standing, voice steady but resonant. Senator, you interrupted me 6 times today, but the truth doesn't yield to interruptions. So I'll finish this thought. When policies protect profit over people, when leaders defend systems that fail their own constituents, that's not governance. That's negligence. She set her papers down. And the people of Wisconsin deserve better. The silence afterward stretched long enough to make even seasoned senators uncomfortable. Johnson leaned back, face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. The chairman finally spoke. Thank you, Congresswoman Crockett. Your testimony will be entered into the record. But as Crockett gathered her notes, Johnson wasn't done. I just want to point out, he said stiffly, that I've dedicated my career to fiscal responsibility. I won't apologize for opposing wasteful spending. Crockett looked up one last time. Fiscal responsibility is admirable, Senator, but moral responsibility, saving lives, should come first. With that, she turned and walked away from the witness table, her heels echoing against the marble floor. The cameras followed every step. Outside the chamber, reporters surged forward. Microphones clustered around her as she exited through the tall wooden doors. "Congresswoman Crockett," one called out, "do you think today's exchange will change any votes in Wisconsin?" Crockett smiled faintly. "It's not about votes, it's about truth. And truth has a way of outlasting sound bites." Another shouted, "Do you regret confronting Senator Johnson so directly?" "Not at all," she said, pausing just long enough for the cameras to focus. "Accountability isn't disrespect. It's democracy." Her staff guided her down the hall as reporters continued shouting questions. Behind her, the doors to the hearing room closed, muffling the noise inside, but not the impact. Inside, Senator Johnson sat motionless, his aides whispering urgently. The network commentators outside were already dissecting every exchange, playing clips of the confrontation in slow motion. Across social media, the video spread within minutes. Clips titled "Jasmine Crockett Destroys Ron Johnson with Wisconsin Data" and "Crockett's Facts Leave Johnson Speechless" flooded timelines. By evening, Crockett vs. Johnson was trending nationwide. News anchors replayed the moment when Crockett said, "Freedom without access isn't freedom. It's an illusion." That single line became a headline, quoted on every major network. Commentators praised her composure, her command of data, her refusal to yield under pressure. Even conservative analysts acknowledged her preparation. On Morning Joe, a panelist remarked, "You can't fake that level of readiness." Crockett walked in with the receipts, literally and figuratively. Johnson didn't know what hit him. Meanwhile, in Wisconsin, local stations interviewed residents from rural counties Crockett had mentioned. Farmers, nurses, and small business owners confirmed her statistics. One elderly couple from Barron County held up a map identical to the one she displayed at the hearing. "She was right," the husband said. "We lost our hospital 2 years ago. Now the nearest emergency room is 70 miles away. Maybe somebody up there finally heard us." By the end of the week, several Wisconsin newspapers ran editorials urging state leaders to reconsider Medicaid expansion. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel headline read, "Crockett's Challenge: Hard Questions for Wisconsin's Healthcare Future." Even in Washington, the hearing had ripple effects. The House Healthcare Caucus announced new bipartisan meetings focused on rural access. The footage from Crockett's testimony was entered into committee archives as part of official record, a rare move for a guest witness. When a reporter later asked her if she planned to run for Senate one day, she laughed softly. "I plan to keep fighting where I am. But if the truth scares them this much, maybe that's a sign." Her words circulated widely, cementing her as both a rising star and a formidable voice in Congress. And as for Senator Johnson, the following week, he appeared on a local radio show defending his record. But even there, callers pressed him with the same statistics Crockett had cited. The host asked pointedly, "Senator, are you reconsidering any of your healthcare votes after that exchange?" Johnson hesitated, then replied, "We'll review the data." For some, that was an admission of doubt. For others, a political survival instinct. But the outcome was clear. The confrontation had shifted the conversation. Back in Texas, Jasmine Crockett returned to her office late one evening. Her staff had left, the lights dim except for the glow of her computer screen. On it was an email from a Wisconsin nurse thanking her for finally saying what we've been living. Crockett read it twice, then closed her laptop. She didn't smile, but the faintest expression of resolve crossed her face. She looked out the window toward the Capitol dome, lit against the night sky. In politics, moments like these were rare, the kind that cut through noise and linger in the nation's conscience. And on that October night, one thing was undeniable. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just testified. She had made history.